Peter Guber is an American film producer, executive chairman, and CEO of Mandalay Entertainment. Films he has produced, very impressive. Listen to this lineup: Rain Man, Batman, The Color Purple, Midnight Express, Gorillas in the Mist, and Flashdance. And here is what Guber says: I have come to see that stories are not only for the big screen, Shakespearean plays, and John Grisham novels. I have come to see that they are far more than entertainment. They are the most effective form of human communication, more powerful than any other way of packaging information. And telling purposeful stories is certainly the most efficient means of persuasion in everyday life, the most effective ways of translating ideas into action, whether you're greenlighting a $90 million film project, motivating employees to meet an important deadline, or getting your kids through a crisis. I love that quote. Telling purposeful stories. This morning we are in the third week of a sermon series titled Stories Jesus Told. We have learned in the Gospels that Jesus was a storyteller, and he told these powerful stories to engage his audience, to engage his listeners, to draw them into a particular story, to point them to God. The Bible calls these stories parables. And we have defined a parable as an analogy used to captivate, illustrate, motivate, and encourage us to participate. The story we want to look at that Jesus told this morning is found in Luke chapter 16. So if you brought your New Testament this morning, please turn to Luke chapter 16. The parable is actually found in verses 1 through 8, but I believe the context extends through verse 15. So here in just a moment, we're going to read this text. But before we do so, I want to ask 3 questions. And this is our way of looking how we might participate, involve ourselves in this particular story. Question number 1. Have you ever been in a crisis? I think most of us probably have. Staff was involved in a minor crisis this morning. We couldn't get the lights to come on in the auditorium. And when I stepped in to teach my Bible class at 5 minutes till 9, we still didn't have lights. And so we were preparing to worship in the dark this morning. A crisis. And yet, leave it to Travis to solve the crisis. And we have lights, okay? Second question. Yeah, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Have you ever been a little sneaky? Oh, come on. Yeah, I think all of us maybe at one time or another, maybe as a child, maybe as a teenager, maybe even as an adult, we've been a little sneaky. If you need to be around someone like that, come and hang out with me when I have my 4-year-old grandson. Third question. Have you ever been entrusted with a little task? So those 3 questions to think about, contemplate as we work our way through this parable this morning. Have you ever been in a crisis? Have you ever been a little sneaky? Have you ever been entrusted with a little task? So the story we want to cover this morning is traditionally referred to as the parable of the unjust steward. Some of the modern translations will read dishonest manager. This particular story is unique to Luke, though there is conceptual overlap with another parable or story that Jesus tells that we typically refer to as the parable of the talents. We find it recorded both in Matthew 25 as well as Luke chapter 19. Now, here is what's interesting about this particular parable this morning. Most New Testament scholars agree this is a difficult parable to understand. In fact, Klein Snodgrass, I've referred to previously in this sermon series, who's written a pretty thick commentary just on the parables of Jesus. He says this parable is notoriously difficult. Darrell Bach says Luke 16, verses 1 through 8, contains probably the most difficult parable in Luke. Craig Blomberg of Denver Seminary says of all of Jesus' parables, this is probably the most puzzling. Thomas Long, this is perhaps the most difficult of all of Jesus' parables. So that is to say, our work is cut out for us this morning. And many, when they read this parable, are offended primarily on two grounds. Number one, some find it disturbing that Jesus would find anything commendable in a dishonest person. And that's what he appears to do in this story he told. Number two, others find it troublesome that Jesus would use the word shrewd or clever, or as I used, tricky, to describe his disciples. So those are a couple of the things that we hope to better understand or unpack as we work our way through this parable this morning. So let's begin by reading the parable. Again, it's found in Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through the very first portion of verse 8. Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses.' So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' 900 gallons of olive oil,' he replied. The manager told him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, 'And how much do you owe?' 1,000 bushels of wheat,' he replied. He told him, 'Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. All right. So here's how I would summarize this story, this parable that Jesus has told. A wealthy man has a manager who is responsible for the wealthy man's business. He apparently serves as a bill collector or accountant of some kind. Charges are brought against the manager that he has wasted his boss's resources. An audit of the manager is demanded. Contemplating his options, the manager develops a plan to charm his boss's debtors so that they will help him later in case he lowers the creditor's bill, or in each case. The reduction is significant and would be met with much appreciation. We have a manager of an estate who basically cheats his master in order to ingratiate himself with his clients. The boss commends his manager, not for being dishonest, but for shrewdly preparing for his future after he is fired. The master praises the steward for his quick thinking, his shrewdness or wisdom to ensure his own future. So that is basically the story in a synopsis. But the text continues with the rest of verse 8 and verse 9, where Jesus offers an explanation of the story. Let's continue reading. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. So what does Jesus mean in this explanation? People in the world give more thought to their physical well-being than the righteous give to their spiritual well-being. The accusation is still painfully true that the people of this age are wiser in their arena than the children of light are in theirs. Is it because with one eye on this age and one eye on the kingdom, a necessary split vision, that we allow ourselves to be determined more by this world rather than Christ's kingdom? So Jesus develops this point even more so in verse 9. Wealth in this world should be used generously so that disciples will be welcomed into heaven. Luke, perhaps more than the other three gospel writers, has Jesus teaching and talking to his disciples about wealth and the proper use of wealth. To gain friends for oneself does not mean to use money to buy friendship, but at the spiritual level of the story, to use possessions for kingdom priorities, to win and disciple converts. So I might paraphrase verse 9 this way. Put yourself as a disciple of Jesus in a good position through the use of your money, which so easily leads you astray, so that when this age is over, God will receive you into his eternal dwelling. Or in other words, riches, which have the power to distort values, should be put to generous and serving use. I mean, generosity, I believe, is a theme in this story. And we see where God honors those who are generous. So disciples are to handle material things so as to secure heaven and the future. How one handles material things has eternal consequences, as God will evaluate our use of the resources he has given to us. Or as the bumper sticker reads, don't be had by what you have. Right? But Jesus continues to teach about the use of wealth in verses 10 through 13. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one, Jesus says, can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Those who can be trusted with little, Jesus says, can be trusted with much. And so the life of the disciple is one of faithful attention to the frequent and familiar task of each day, however small and insignificant they may seem. And so I believe Jesus is wanting us to recognize that life consists of a series of seemingly small opportunities. Every person is faced with a fundamental choice of allegiance. The older English translations read, "You cannot serve both God and mammon." Mammon there is the word simply for money. And again, I believe Jesus is teaching us that if we're not careful, our money, our possessions, materialism can enslave us. But God requires exclusive loyalty. Right? But the text continues for 2 more verses. Let's look at verses 14 and 15. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight." Jesus accuses the Pharisees here of being lovers of money, literally a friend of silver. And he must have had them and this internal attitude in mind as he shared this story with his disciples. And so when we step back and we look at this particular story, I believe there are 3 things to kind of highlight, to contemplate, points to ponder, if you will, from this story that maybe can challenge us a little bit today. And again, the challenge is to participate in this story in some way, right? First of all, let's talk about the word shrewd, right? Synonyms to this word could include tricky, as I've already mentioned, cagey, slick, sly, wily. All right? If you look it up in the dictionary, it's defined as astute or sharp in particular matters. Now, when you look at the word in its original language, in the Greek language, it belongs to a word group associated with the mind and thinking. Right? And I believe in the 2.5 years I've been here, I have preached one sermon from the book of Colossians in which we talked about how important our thoughts and how we think are to the Apostle Paul. Several times in his letters, he emphasizes thinking and being thoughtful. And so Paul would probably add a verse to that old VBS song, "Be careful, little eyes, what you see, and be careful, little feet, where you go." He would probably add, "Be careful, little mind, what you think." And as I've said in previous lessons and classes, I think for Paul, he would say, we are what we think. And so the importance of thinking like Jesus. Well, when you look at some of the other translations of this particular story, the New American Standard Bible reads shrewdly. The Common English Bible reads cleverly. But the King James and the Old American Standard Version of 1901 both of those translations read wisely. Right? So that might contextually and in its application to us as disciples of Jesus, that might be the better way to look at this particular word. Not so much in being clever or tricky as much as it means to be wise. Are we living life wisely? Are we pursuing the wisdom of God in our lives? Just as this manager or this steward, when he was in this crisis, thought through the situation and thought very wisely about his future. The second important word that might can help us understanding or at least applying this particular story is the word manager. That is also translated as steward. The Greek word is a compound word which literally means to be ruler of the house, which suggests responsibility, right? And I know I taught or preached a sermon about stewardship since I've been here. And I define a steward as one to whom something or someone has been entrusted, right? So if something has been entrusted to you or someone has been entrusted to you, we've experienced that this morning with these new parents. They've had a child now entrusted to them. They are responsible for that child. And as a disciple of Jesus, every one of us has been entrusted with something. As we're being challenged this year as a congregation to accept that entrustment and to do our part. All of us have a part to play. Ephesians 4 has become very important to our leadership team, to our elders, and to our staff. Paul's emphasis there is the building up of the body. And in our context, the building up of the Alameda body. And that can only happen if all of us are doing our part, contributing in some way. And so that's one of the minor subpoints, I guess, of this lesson, right? To realize you've been entrusted with something. That's what it means to be a steward. And so it implies three things, as I have previously preached. This portion of our sermon brought to us by the letter A, ability. We all have some ability. That implies an assignment, a task to be carried out that perhaps only you can do. Right? And then the third thing, accountability. Right? God is going to hold us accountable, just as this employer held this employee accountable. So the concept of being a steward. And then finally, this sense of urgency. I quoted Thomas Long as being one of those New Testament scholars who reads this as a challenging parable, a difficult parable to understand and perhaps even apply. And in his little commentary on the parables of Jesus, he classifies this particular parable as a crisis parable, where one of the key characters in the story is facing a crisis. Or as Long puts it, it's what do I do now kind of story. And this manager was placed in a crisis. And he had to think very quickly. And again, he's commended not for his dishonesty and cheating his manager, his employer, but he's commended for looking towards the future in a very wise way. Right? And so the question for us is, do we live our spiritual lives with the same kind of sense of urgency? You know, we we plan as best we can for our future physically, right? I think the goal for all of us is to someday be able to retire, and just kind of rest. And so we try to prepare for that. Or if we have children, we have a family, we try to prepare for their future. Perhaps a future education or whatever it might be. And we tend to do that with some sense of urgency because we realize the importance of it, right? I mean, we do those things. And so again, the challenge, I think, at least one challenge, as I understand it, from this particular story is, do we plan spiritually for our future? Do we live our Christian lives? Do we walk with Jesus with the same sense of urgency? Well, he's taught us that we are to do that wisely, and we are to do it with a sense of assignment, knowing that one day he will hold us accountable.